Hello, my name is Alex, and welcome to Magic Missile Minis. I'm back. It's been a little while, but recently I found some time to make some videos, so you should be able to expect videos for the next little while, hopefully weekly. But in this episode, I'm going to be making a mimic, which, for those of you who don't know, is a classic example of early Dungeons and Dragons weirdness. Basically a treasure chest that's actually a creature just with a big old mouth. So without further ado, let's jump on into the project. I start by taking two pieces of foam core and gluing them together, and then taking a little bit of wire and creating a loose kind of V or M shape that I'm going to stick into the foam core that's going to be for the lid of the chest mimic. I then cut out a little piece into the foam core and then cover the whole thing in green stuff, trying to focus on creating the general treasure chest shape in the lid as well as the rest of the body. Now that we have a fairly basic kind of shape for the mimic, I can start adding some of the details. The first details I wanted to add were going to be the gums for the mimic that I decided I kind of want to have kind of being splayed out a little bit. So the teeth are kind of spreading out and being fairly kind of monstrous and just generally weird, which I feel like matches the vibe of the mimic really, really well. As I'm sculpting this, I'm basically adding in these little divots into the top here where I'm going to be putting the teeth, allowing there to be a little bit of texture created with the metal ball point that I'm using to sculpt the gums with, and this will create a nice organic feeling gum texture. Dry, I start to add the little noodles of green stuff around the inside of the mouth to create a little bit of texture and interest, just to kind of make it look organic and a little bit more intentional as opposed to just leaving it with the green stuff kind of default texture, so to speak. Once we let the details we just added set, I start to think about how I'm going to continue to sculpt it and realized I need a handle for this guy. So I bore a couple holes into the bottom of the miniature here that I can then stick some of these wires through. And so these wires are then going to go into a little cork bottle that I have here, or I should say glass bottle with a cork top. And I found these at my local dollar store, and they seem to do a really great job to act as like sculpting handles and stuff like that. The next step of the process I needed to work on was actually adding the tentacles that were going to be keeping this guy kind of up in the air like the supports would suggest. So I go around and just add these long noodles of green stuff around the lower section of the mimic and cut them off around the base so that it's going to look like they're actually attached to and pushing off from the base that we're going to be adding on later once the model's finished. While I let the tentacles set, I go over to the top and start adding the eyes by just taking some little green stuff balls and sticking them on in places. I decided rather than just giving him two eyes, I was going to give him a bunch of like different little ones and slightly bigger ones here and there so that he looked a little less corny, but also I think it just kind of makes him look a little bit creepier and more monstrous. tentacles in place and the eyeballs where I want them, and they're all set, I can take some more green stuff and start working on the actual wooden texture for this miniature. The way that I go about doing this is just adding the little pieces of green stuff and flattening them out into a basic shape that would be a wooden plank. I don't really need to be too careful about this because I'm trying to get across the idea that it's kind of like a camouflage, or kind of like when an octopus changes colors or something, that the texture is actually going to be going away and blending back into the more organic nature of this creature. So I can kind of add this in loosely, and hopefully I can figure out a way to get that across. With the wood grain texture now finished, it was time to move on to his teeth. And so I take little pieces of green stuff and I kind of roll them in my fingers to create teardrop shapes that I then just stick into the little gum holes that we had made earlier, taking one of my sculpting tools and pressing them in place and trying to make sure that the green stuff is actually kind of connecting to the green stuff that's already dried. I decided with this guy to make sure that the teeth I was making were fairly thick. Since I only had one layer of teeth, I needed to make sure they kind of filled that space really well, because otherwise the mouth might look kind of empty and lackluster. The next thing I needed to work on was actually making the tongue for this guy. So I take some wire and I bend that into a bit of a curving shape that's going to follow the kind of shape that I want the tongue to actually be in. And then I cover that in green stuff. You'll notice that I keep a little bit of the wire out, and this is what I'm actually going to use to attach the tongue to the rest of the model. Just kind of stabbing that through the green stuff that's already dried. In theory, I would have put the wire in first and let it set by adding a little bit of green stuff and then sculpted the rest of the tongue on top of it. But to be honest, I was feeling a little bit lazy. And so we're just going to be smoothing it out with rubber. And with that last detail added, the sculpt for this miniature is finished. And all it needs is a quick prime and then a paint job. So, to start off the paint job, I covered the entire model in a dark brownish red, and this is going to act as my base coat, primarily to focus on the flesh tone that is going to kind of be underneath everything. This way I can basically have everything be building up from this darker flesh tone, since the idea for this model is for him to be coming out of the camouflage. So even the wooden panels are going to have the kind of fleshy shadow to imply that they're kind of going away. And then go around the miniature, adding a kind of even darker brown to the back of the miniature where I want some shadows to lie. And I'm keeping this fairly loose as the paint's still wet on the miniature, and it's just going to be a nice shadow layer that I can then refine later on as I want to make more decisions about lighting and things of that nature. With the red added, I now go and add some brown onto all of the actual wooden parts here, and I'm noticing that the brown is looking a little bit too red at this point, and so to avoid that, I'm going to add a little bit of green to the paint to make it contrast a little bit more with the red.
because as you may know, green is actually the contrasting color to red. And so this will just help the wood stand out on the red backdrop a little bit better. With some of the base colors done, I start going over all of the tentacles with a lighter pink to start working on some highlights, starting with kind of the brightest highlight and then working my way into the shadows. My focus as I'm painting the tentacles is to basically do a slightly rougher, more stippled look to create a little bit of texture on them, rather than creating a perfectly smooth finish. That way they can look a little bit more organic and interesting. Once the tentacles are finished, I start painting some highlights onto the wood, doing a loose dry brush over all of the wood paneling, trying to avoid the details that I've added onto the tentacles themselves. I go over the wood panels with a couple different colors, making them brighter every single time and adding less of them every single time. After that, I can then go on to painting all of the teeth, starting with a kind of bright yellow that I'm going to dull down later on using a dark brown wash to make everything look kind of gritty and kind of nasty. I then go over and start painting the eyes that we hid in between all the different wood paneling with a bright orange so that they can stand out a little bit. And then mixing a little bit of red into the orange, I start to play around with some gradients to make them stand out even more and just add some interest to the eyes to make sure they're not just one color with like a black pupil in the middle. And then I go around adding a highlight to create a nice kind of glowing effect onto all of the eyes, increasing the brightness of the highlight simply by adding a little bit of white to the orange we were using originally. Then taking a very fine brush with a very dark red, I go in and add little slits for the pupils. And with the eyes now finished, I can go around doing a dark brown wash over the vast majority of the miniature, starting out with the teeth like I had mentioned earlier on, but also going around into the recesses of all of the wooden textures to just add an extra layer of depth. However, with these shadows, I don't go too hard on them, and I try to wipe away at some of the... And now with those final details added, all we need to do is give this miniature a base. I'm quite pleased with how this project turned out. I'm particularly happy with the kind of four-way kind of Demogorgon split mouth. I think that helps it look extra monstrous and weird. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this project looks, and just the paint job I think turned out really well. If you like that video, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, hit the bell to get notified when I release more videos, and if you have any suggestions for different creatures you want me to sculpt, leave it in the comments below. But once again, thank you so much for watching that video, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.